So, welcome to this brief presentation about the reform of the CAP, something that's leading to increased protests across the EU. We've seen them here in France and in other countries. And as you can see there from the list of key issues, it's quite a touchstone topic in terms of the EU, territorial cohesion across the territory, as well as its interaction in a globalised economy. And certainly one of the challenges that's facing the EU, it's fair to say, facing the whole world. Um, but certainly facing the EU as a trade bloc within a globalized world. So a great contemporary case study to be able to understand and reference. So as we start to look at the basic geography, you can see that EU spending roughly sits at around about 55 billion euros a year. Much of that, 70% of that is spent on direct payments to farmers to support them and to support their livelihoods. And you'll see in a second when we take a look that they're changing the way. It used to be that that was just purely for production of food, but we're seeing that that's changing over time. You can see there that France, Spain, Germany, Italy, major recipients of this expenditure. Some of the countries, such as Poland, Hungary, out there in the east, substantial recipients, but really still the older, if you like, the core areas of the EU, essentially being the ones that are benefiting the most, certainly in terms of euros from the cap. So if we look at the sector itself, you can see a lot of people employed, but sometimes not a lot of output. So Romania, Poland, 1.5 million plus people employed in those areas. So there's a big drop off though, and as you can see towards the right hand side of the graph, um, not many people employed in this as a sector, and the figures at the top tell their own story. Although 180 billion of value added looks impressive, it's about 1.3% only of the gross domestic product, and therefore there's often been a feeling that the cap is in need of a revamp because it's a disproportionate investment for what comes out of it. You can see also that there's a bit of a gap between the number of people employed in agriculture and actual food production, which is the higher value activities that take on further up through the chain, with Spain, Germany France and Germany dominating, Poland, Italy, and Spain also major contributors there. But that kind of added value to the chain very much in those kind of older established members of the EU. Now, the agricultural sector, so as a result, sorry, the agricultural sector is coming under pressure to reform, to have a look at that money, how it's spent, how it's invested, certainly in terms of not just in supporting farmers, but also in terms of regional development and that EU territorial cohesion, trying to support those peripheral areas to diversify into new industries. But the agricultural sector is traditionally viewed with suspicion, measures brought by the EU. Especially in more recent years, there are attempts to make it more sustainable with those green direct payments, and but still, 70% of the money of the 55 billion is spent on direct payments to farmers. Part of this revamp, as you can see from the graphic, includes they're asking farmers to devote at least 4% of arable land, which could be grown on, to non-productive features. In other words, set aside, not actually using it at all. Requiring them to carry out crop rotations, reducing fertilizer usage in the first instance by at least 20% as part of environmental measures. But what's happening here is the farmers are warning the EU that this will make the EU agricultural sector less competitive due to the fact that it will raise costs and increase wastage. They're also objecting, sorry, to the ban on pesticides and herbicides that's been brought forward by the broader EU Green Deal. And also, there's been criticism recently of the EU signing an EU-wide treaty that actually opens up markets to Brazilian and Argentinian beef, with farmers trying to compete with those countries, feeling that they are having their hands tied behind their backs by increased environmental concerns. Obviously, we know it's a very controversial way of farming in terms of environmental impact, but also feeling that animal welfare standards in the EU are very, very high, and they're less so in other countries, and therefore those countries can have reduced costs, and as a result undercut European producers with meat products that essentially come from areas where environmental and animal welfare concerns aren't as high. So we can see that this reform is meeting with a great deal of resistance. We saw it here in France, and the French farmers' anger really is comes from a complicated mesh of different policies and also funding cuts that are taking place. So subsidies were being removed on certain for environmental issues. So, for instance, subsidies were being taken off agricultural diesel. Water consumption, which is very high in the agricultural sector, was being taxed at a higher rate, and up to 47 million euros a year of extra water fees were due to be charged to the agricultural sector. And some of these environmental regulations were seemingly extremely complex and overlapping policies and a lack of clarity that was frustrating many farmers. Um, Farmers also find that applying for those direct payments, which used to come to support their industry, were becoming increasingly difficult. And a recent survey said that French farmers spend around about 1 day a week just on paperwork and not actually farming. So some of these policies were contradictory. They said that leaving the agricultural industry, attempting to reduce impact on the environment. So all the time they've been told reduce impact on the environment, reduce impact on the environment, but also we want you to increase food production. And that kind of dichotomy was causing a huge amount of frustration. Um, and as a result, people were leaving the sector. And one of the things that the farmers are also concerned about is the future of food production, particularly here in France, where they say that the people are dropping out of the industry. And what does that mean for food security in the future? So the government has listened a little bit just before Christmas. They rode back on some of those fees they were going to impose for pumping groundwater and releasing pesticides, and they also held back on the diesel, dropping the diesel subsidy. But and also there's a controversial weed killer called glyphosate, which they still haven't imposed the ban on that. So there's been some cosmetic allowances given to farmers to take the heat out of the current situation, but really. Those underlying issues of the reform of the CAP and the pressure on the agricultural sector and the pressure from external producers is still very much there. And that anger is spreading across Europe. Um, Last year, Dutch farmers blocked roads. They dumped manure in the streets, and loved dumping huge piles of manure outside politicians' houses. But one of the issues affecting the Netherlands, of course, is very intensive farming. So although they are one of the world's largest agricultural exporters, they're responsible for a huge amount of nitrogen emissions. So they are also coming under um, increasing pressure to reduce that, with the High Court even in the Netherlands a couple of years ago imposing very, very strict standards on the government to reduce that in the agricultural sector. Um, so the government had to buy out certain farmers as a result because they found they couldn't farm anymore. So the government tried to appease the farming sector by actually buying out some of the livestock farmers. But farmers feeling generally not very well treated. So they find that they'd already cut nitrogen emissions significantly in the last 30 years as part of a general drive in the sector, and that this new imposition from the government was too stringent. And there's a feeling also that many of the uh, many of the farmers were suffering from investment being taken out of rural areas and placed into urban areas, which again is something that's contrary to the EU's cohesion agenda. It also has political impacts. Many far right parties who often find huge amounts of support in rural areas found that they were making inroads in rural areas, and as a result, it became a political challenge to the EU. In Germany, the big issue in Germany was fuel subsidies, which were worth up to about 3,000 euros a year to the average farmer, and they tried to phase those out again as an environmental measure. And again, in Germany, there's a long-seated resentment that the urban elite are imposing ill thought out and unfair impositions on the rural and agricultural sectors. So in Germany, farmers took to the streets again, as they had done in France, as they had done in the Netherlands, and in recent times in Spain and Italy, and even in Romania, Hungary, and some parts of Eastern Europe. Well, those are slightly for different issues, which we'll come on to a second. But again, the farmers saying that in theory, as a principle, they are supportive of green, genetically unmodified farming, but it needs to come with a with the relevant and right amount of support from the EU. It's a feeling that all of this is happening very, very quickly, and it's undermining the farming sector here in the EU. How that plays out in the coming months is going to be very, very interesting. There are EU elections in June, and what kind of parties who are looking to place pressure on the EU to not reform the cap or to support rural areas will be interesting. But also a big impact on all of this has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As you can see there, Ukraine is a massive wheat producer. This is wheat production. The graph on the left is wheat production in millions of tons, and that's during the conflict. So you can imagine what it was like before, despite the blockade, a substantially higher wheat production than other great producers in the eastern part of the EU. And to try to support Ukraine in a way that it could, using its trade and soft power, the EU decided to set up what it calls solidarity lanes, which was giving the Ukraine access to European markets and also allowing them to transport and move their products through the EU. So they lifted those restrictions, and as you know, the average Ukrainian organic farm is around about 1,000 hectares in size, whereas the average European organic farm, by comparison, is about 41. So, you know, they are substantially bigger enterprises. And prices in neighboring countries like Hungary, Poland, Romania basically went through the floor. Local farmers couldn't sell their crops because they were complying with EU regulations. And again, last year we saw huge blockades across Poland, where it was, you know, there was an amazing graphic that I saw that I wasn't able to find, where on one hand there were Polish citizens waving busloads of Ukrainian refugees through, cheering them, welcoming them into their country as the Russians invaded. And then a matter of months later, tractors blockading trucks coming from the Ukraine with grain on them, trying to stop them coming into the countries. So the EU is facing a problem there with many of those countries trying to ban Ukrainian grain coming in. Um, and there's still lingering concerns for many across the agricultural sector, excessively high taxes, increasingly tight regulations. Of course, farmers are feeling the impacts of climate change in through droughts, floods, wildfires, and they're claiming that policies imposed by the urban elites of the EU are squeezing them even further. So we're expecting more protests. We know that in Spain and Italy, that's increased. We're expecting more protests as we come up to European Parliament elections in June. But here is just, like I said, just a brief rundown of how the reform of the cap is overlaid with lots of other issues going on at the moment to provide a real challenge to the EU and to its position both as an instrument of territorial cohesion and also of globalisation. Thanks very much.